The document they filed was 11 pages long. Arbiter Thesivane remembered that detail specifically, not the ruling itself, not the vote count, not the formal language of expulsion, but the fact that humanity's entire case for remaining in the Galactic Council had been condensed into 11 pages. Every other species facing review had submitted thousands. The Keth had sent 42 volumes when their mining rights were challenged. The Vorali had delivered a legal argument that took 3 years to fully translate. Humanity sent 11 pages, single-spaced. Thesivane had read it twice, looking for the part where they begged. There wasn't one. The banishment itself had been clean, as these things went. 43 member species, 39 votes in favor of expulsion, 3 abstentions, and 1 species. The Murath, who had voted against, then immediately filed a formal apology to the chamber for having done so under what they described as momentary empathetic contamination. The humans had sat through the entire proceeding in their delegation seats, 4 of them, none moving, none speaking, watching the tally board with expressions that Thesivane's pattern recognition substrate still could not categorize with confidence. Not grief, not rage, something else. Something that had made the chamber feel, for just a moment, slightly colder than it had been before. The expulsion order was transmitted to Earth at the standard administrative frequency. Acknowledgement was required within 72 galactic standard hours. Humanity acknowledged in 6 minutes. No message, no appeal, no formal protest registered. Just acknowledged. That single word had bothered Thesivane for 11 months. It still bothered him now, standing in the observation corridor outside the Council's deep space monitoring array, watching the alert that had just rearranged every assumption he'd carefully constructed about what the humans were doing out there in their little quarantined corner of the Orion Arm. The alert wasn't about a weapon. It wasn't about a fleet. It was about a sound. Humanity had been transmitting since the moment their communication privileges were suspended. Not to the Council, the relay protocols had been locked out, that was standard procedure, but outward. Deep space broadcast, unfocused, omnidirectional, cycling on 17 frequencies simultaneously, burning through enough power that the energy signature alone had triggered 3 separate early warning systems before analysts confirmed it wasn't a weapon test. The content of the transmission had taken 4 months to decode, because the first 3 analyst teams had assumed it was encrypted. It wasn't encrypted. It was music. 41 terabytes of it, organized into what the translation division eventually identified as a coherent archive. Historical recordings, live performances, something that appeared to be instructional notation, and a 96-minute composition that the humans had apparently created specifically for this broadcast. New work, made after the banishment. Their singing, senior analyst Vorath had told the chamber at the time, in a tone that conveyed profound uncertainty about whether that word adequately described what he was reporting. Into deep space, to no one in particular. The chamber had reached a consensus quickly. It was a psychological display, defiance performance. Humans were known for these symbolic acts calculated to project strength and indifference. The music meant nothing practically. It was theater. That consensus had lasted until 7 weeks ago, when the Drasen Collective sent a relay to the Council chambers marked Asterisk Urgent, Biological Emergency Asterisk, describing an outbreak of what their medical systems initially categorized as mass psychological contamination across 4 of their border colony stations. The contamination vector, once isolated, was a 96-minute piece of human music that a Drasen cargo worker had downloaded from the broadcast archive during an unsanctioned comm relay stop near the quarantine boundary. He'd shared it with 12 colleagues. Those 12 had shared it further. The Drasen used the word weeping in their medical report, but their translators added a footnote noting the term was imprecise. Their species did not weep in the human physiological sense, and what was actually occurring was closer to what humans might call asterisk yearning without object, a sustained emotional state with no identifiable cause, no survival function, and no clear mechanism for resolution. 340 dressing affected. Productivity loss across 4 stations. 2 individuals who described, under psychological evaluation, an inexplicable compulsion to send something back to whoever had made the sound. The council had immediately classified the music archive as a biological hazard and issued a quarantine extension around Earth's broadcast range. Which was when Thesivane had noticed the second thing. "Pull the timestamp," he said to the monitoring technician beside him, a young Veth named Carriel who had the particular posture of someone very recently aware that their career had entered a complex phase. The new composition. When did Earth begin broadcasting it? Carriel's manipulators moved over the data surface. 51 days after the expulsion order was acknowledged. 51 days. Thesivane processed that. How long does it take humans to compose something of that complexity? A pause. We don't have reliable data on that, Arbiter. Guess. Another pause longer. Months, years. The archive contains recordings they describe as centuries old, so the tradition itself is. They wrote it in 51 days, Thesivane said, after being expelled from the only interstellar governance body in the known galaxy, after losing every trade agreement, every diplomatic protection, every legal standing they'd spent 60 years building. They sat down and wrote music. He let that settle. That is the detail no one in this chamber has correctly weighted. Carriel said nothing. The alert on the monitoring display continued to pulse softly. "What's the new alert?" Thesivane asked. "The Murath," Carriel said carefully. "Their deep space listening posts have registered significantly. They're calling it resonance pattern anomalies along the quarantine boundary." "Which means what?" Carriel looked at him with the expression of someone who had triple-checked a calculation and profoundly wished they hadn't. "The humans changed the broadcast about 6 weeks ago. Same frequencies, same power output, same transmission protocol, but the content is different now." "Different how?" "It's no longer music." Carriel's voice had gone very steady in the way voices go when someone is actively managing their own reaction to information. "It's language. Specifically, it appears to be responses, to us, to council proceedings, transcripts of debates, proposals, policy documents, a breath, things the council discussed in closed session." The monitoring corridor was very quiet for a moment. "That's not possible," Thesivane said. "Closed sessions are." "Arbiter," Carriel touched the display, bringing up a specific segment. "The transcript of the expulsion vote, the private deliberations, including Delegate Voss Samarath's comment that humanity's biological volatility represents a long-term existential variable the Council cannot afford to manage indefinitely." That comment had never been officially recorded. Thesivane knew it had been said. He had been in the room. "The humans have it," Carriel said, "word for word, and they broadcast it." The emergency session convened in 4 hours, which was fast by council standards and therefore notable. 43 species, or their designated proxies, arranged in the chamber's concentric tiers, the murmur of translation processors filling the air beneath the formal lighting. Delegate Voss Samarath of the Keth was already speaking when Thesivane took his arbiter's position. "An intelligence breach of this magnitude indicates that the expulsion process was itself compromised. If human agents had access to closed deliberations." "They had no agents," said Delegate Four Eyes of the Yelm, interrupting with the particular sharpness of someone who had prepared for this argument. "The humans had no registered diplomatic presence after expulsion, no recognized legal standing, no right of access to any council facility." "Then how did they?" I've been asking myself that for 6 hours, Fourier said, and I've arrived at a hypothesis I would prefer to be wrong about. She paused. What if they never stopped listening? What if the intelligence infrastructure they built during 60 years of council membership was never dismantled, because we never thought to require it? Because we assumed expulsion would make it impossible to use, and because— another pause. Because none of us modeled what a species does when it has absolutely nothing left to lose and 60 years of accumulated access. The chamber was quiet in the specific way that chambers go quiet when a room full of very intelligent beings simultaneously realizes they have made an error. They're not transmitting defiance, Thessalvain said, and every head turned toward him. He didn't intend to have said it aloud, but now that he had, he continued. The music was never defiance. It was never theater. He could feel the shape of something assembling itself in his understanding, pieces that had seemed unrelated for 11 months suddenly pressing toward configuration. They sent music first. Why music? No one answered. Because it cannot be argued with, he said. Because it requires no translation of intent. Because it bypassed every diplomatic and legal framework, all of which we controlled, and spoke directly to the biological response systems of species who were not party to the expulsion decision. He looked at the chamber. They weren't performing. They were building a constituency. The word asterisk constituency rippled through the translation processors and came out differently in 37 languages, but the reaction was consistent: unease. The kind of unease that has the specific flavor of retrospective recognition, of realizing that a game has been in progress longer than you thought, and you've been playing it without knowing the rules. The Drassing affected, said Delegate Fourier. 340 individuals experiencing sustained emotional response. The Murath who voted against expulsion and then filed an apology. Have we followed up on their current position? Silence. Has anyone, she said more precisely, checked the voting disposition of the Murath delegation in the last 11 months? Thessalvain turned to Carriel, who had followed him into the chamber and now wore the expression of someone who had absolutely already checked this and had been hopping not to be asked. The Murath, Carriel said, have quietly withdrawn their apology. They filed it under administrative correction, not a formal reversal, so it did not trigger a review flag. Additionally, their ambassador-at-large has made unofficial contact with delegations from the Yelm, the Paloran, and the Civ Collective in the last 60 days. Contact about what? Vosamarath demanded. The humans, Carriel said. Specifically, about what happens to council authority if the expulsion is successfully challenged on grounds of procedural legitimacy. Another silence, longer. Can it be? Someone asked from the upper tier. The expulsion vote passed with 39 affirmatives, Fourier said, very carefully. The council charter requires 37 for a binding expulsion, but it also contains a proviso, Article 14, subsection 9, which states that an expulsion can be retrospectively invalidated if it can be demonstrated that the expelled party was denied due process, specifically, adequate time and resources to mount a formal defense. Humanity had 60 days, Vosamarath said. Humanity had 60 days, yes, but the charter specifies adequate resources. The humans submitted 11 pages. She let that settle. Not because they had nothing to say, because they had nothing left to pay the council's registered legal translation services with. Their economic access had been frozen as a precondition of the review process, which is also in the charter and which means they couldn't afford to defend themselves, Thessalvain said. More precisely, Fourier said, we made it structurally impossible for them to defend themselves, and then we counted their inadequate defense as evidence that they had nothing worth defending. The chamber erupted. It took 17 minutes to restore order, which was not a record but was close. In that 17 minutes, Thessalvain stood at his arbiter's position and watched 43 species or their proxies experience a collective realization, and he thought about the 11-page document, and he thought about the single word acknowledged asterisk transmitted 6 minutes after the expulsion order, and he thought about 51 days. He thought they knew. They knew the process was rigged before it concluded. They sat in their delegation seats and watched the vote and said nothing because they had already calculated that nothing they said in that chamber would change the outcome, and they had spent whatever time they had left not in protest but in preparation. "I need the full archive of Earth's deep space transmissions," he said to Carriel quietly under the noise of the chamber. "Everything, every frequency, every format, not just what's been flagged, everything that's been logged since expulsion." "That's a significant volume of data, Arbiter." "I know how many transmissions." Carriel checked, paused, checked again. "At current count," Carriel said, 41,712 individual transmissions. Thessavane turned slowly. "We've been monitoring for 11 months. "Yes. That's roughly 120 transmissions per day." "Yes." "What are they transmitting?" Carriel looked at the display, then at Thessavane, and in that look was the particular quality of someone who has just understood, while being asked to explain something, that they are standing at the edge of something very large. "Everything," Carriel said, "medical research, engineering data, historical records, philosophical texts, educational curricula, art, music far more than the original archive, biological data on over 900 Earth species, climate modeling, agricultural methodology, all of it broadcast on open frequencies, all of it accessible to anyone within range of the signal, a breath. They've been giving it away. 41,000 transmissions of knowledge, resource data, and cultural material, broadcast openly into deep space for 11 months. To who? To everyone, to anyone." A pause that carried weight. "To the 37 non-council species inside and along the quarantine boundary who have been listening." There were 37 non-council species within the broadcast range. That fact had always been true. It had been true when the quarantine was established, true when the broadcast began, and its implications had been in plain sight for 11 months. No one in the council had weighted it correctly, because the assumption had been that non-council species, small, unrecognized, lacking formal standing, were irrelevant to any power calculation worth making. 37 species, some with spaceflight, some without, some with diplomatic histories too complicated for council membership, some who had simply never been invited. 37 species who had spent 11 months receiving daily transmissions of medical research, agricultural methodology, engineering data, and music, all freely given, all without condition, from a civilization the council had publicly expelled and declared a biological and political hazard. 37 species who, as of 6 days ago, had jointly filed a document with the council's External Affairs Office. Thessavane read it in the monitoring corridor while the chamber was still erupting behind him, Carriel having quietly pulled it to his personal display. The document was 419 pages long. It was a formal request for council review of the expulsion order, citing procedural irregularities, filed on behalf of humanity by 37 non-member species, who had collectively invoked the Council's own charter provision for third-party standing. A provision written 600 years ago and never once used, because no non-member species had ever had sufficient standing to invoke it. Until now. Because the Charter's definition of sufficient standing for third-party filing required the backing of at least 25 recognized independent civilizations. 37. They didn't build a legal defense, Thessavane said aloud, to no one in particular, to the monitoring display, to the universe in general. They built a coalition. The human ambassador, when she arrived, and her arrival itself had required an emergency procedural vote, since humans technically had no right to enter council space, which 3 delegations pointed out loudly and 7 others quietly let pass, was not what the chamber had expected. Her name was Dr. Yara Osai. She was 53 years old by human reckoning. She had apparently spent the last 11 months working on Earth's agricultural yield models, which had subsequently been included in the Open Broadcast Archive, and which the Paloran had already adapted for use on their desert colony worlds. She was not a diplomat by training. She was a systems ecologist. She carried no prepared statement. She sat in the chair that had been placed at the chamber floor, not in the delegation tier, since humanity had no delegation, a point Vas Samarath had ensured was formally noted. And she looked at 43 species watching her, and she said, clearly and without visible discomfort, "I'm going to ask you one question. You don't have to answer it out loud." The chamber waited. "When we were expelled," she said, "what did you think we would do?" No one answered. The translation processors hummed. "I've read the session transcripts," she said. "The closed ones, not just the public record." A small pause, not smiling, not performing, simply continuing. "You thought we would appeal, or protest, or attempt illegal re-entry, or collapse inward, retreat from space, go quiet, become a contained problem." She folded her hands on the table in front of her. "The possibility that we would spend 11 months giving everything we know to every civilization you'd overlooked, and ask nothing in return, and then let them speak for us, that wasn't in any of your models." Thesavane realized he was holding himself very still. "It wasn't in ours either at first," Osai said. "It took us about a week after the expulsion to agree on it. Some people argued for legal challenges. Some argued for isolation. Some argued for—" A pause. Something moved briefly through her expression, not quite grief, not quite its absence. "Other options. We debated for 6 days." "What ended the debate?" Forias asked, and her voice was the voice of someone who genuinely needed to know. Osai looked at her directly. A 9-year-old in Lagos asked her teacher why the stars had banned us. She did not look away. The teacher didn't have an answer, neither did we, so we decided to stop waiting for one. The chamber deliberated for 9 hours. In the monitoring corridor, Thesavane stood with Carriel and watched the scrolling data from Earth's transmissions and tried to find the moment it had started, the exact decision point, the meeting or the individual or the single conversation that had produced this outcome, and could not locate it because it had not been a single moment. It had been 41,000 moments, each one small, each one a piece of data freely given, each one a small demonstration of something the Council's models had classified as naive. "What does the archive contain?" he asked Carriel, not for the first time. "At the most granular level, what have they been giving away?" Carriel brought up a subsection summary. The Vensarathi border stations received approximately 1,200 transmissions of water purification methodology. Their colony on Vensarathi IV had been managing a water crisis for 7 years. Based on their logged acknowledgement signals, they implemented the human methodology 8 months ago. A pause. Crop yields across the colony are now sufficient to end their import dependency. Continue. The Death Mary, a non-spaceflight species within broadcast range, received biological data on a pathogen they've been losing population to for 2 generations. The transmission included identification, mechanism analysis, and 3 potential treatment approaches. The humans had no specific knowledge of the Death Mary. They broadcast general xenobiological pathogen response methodology. The Death Mary adapted it. "By themselves," Thesavane said. "By themselves, without any contact with Earth, using knowledge freely transmitted to no one in particular." Carriel set down the display. "The Murath, who voted against expulsion and then apologized for it, their apology was filed 14 days after they received a human transmission that included navigational chart updates for the Pelori Drift corridor. The Pelori Drift is notoriously dangerous. The human charts were more detailed than anything the Council's own survey division had produced." Thesivane closed his eyes briefly. The humans have been doing this for 60 years, he said. The entire time they were in the council, just sharing, giving things away, not as strategy, as habit. Yes. We expelled them for being unpredictable. Yes. And then they did the least predictable thing possible. Yes. Which was to keep doing exactly what they had always done. He opened his eyes. Except now, without our permission. The vote to review the expulsion order passed with 31 affirmatives. Vasamarath voted against. 8 delegations abstained, which, Thesivane noted, was itself a shift. Abstentions in a council vote were historically rare, the kind of political risk most delegates avoided instinctively. That 8 chose abstention over affirmation suggested they were unwilling to oppose the motion, but not yet ready to be recorded as supporting it. The legal review process would take months. Osai was still in the corridor when Thesivane found her, waiting for the transport arrangements that Carriel was trying to organize through 3 layers of bureaucratic improvisation. Because technically, a human on council premises had no official status, and therefore no official accommodation allocation. The review will be thorough, Thesivane told her, because he felt something was required of him and he did not know exactly what. She looked at him. She was not a tall person, by human standards or by any other. She looked tired in a way that had clearly been true for a long time. How many of the 37 filed because they wanted to? She asked. He blinked. All of them. How many filed because we asked them to? He paused. None of them. You didn't ask. We never asked anyone for anything, she said. We were very careful about that. She shifted slightly, the motion of someone whose back had been aching for hours. You know what's in the medical research archive? The transmissions flagged as most accessed by non-council species. No. Pain management, she said. Specifically, how to help something keep functioning when it's in pain. We have a lot of data on that. A brief, dry expression that was not quite a smile. Turns out that's useful. He stood there for a moment. Dr. Osai, he said carefully, when you debated for 6 days after the expulsion, what were the other options? The ones you didn't choose. She looked at him with eyes that had the particular quality of having looked at something very large and very dark, and then looked away from it and continued. The kind you can't take back, she said simply. And then Carriel arrived with the transport information, and the conversation ended, and Thesivane stood in the corridor alone for a long time afterward, understanding that humanity's choice to broadcast music into the void had not been their first choice, or their easiest, and that whatever it had cost them to choose it, they had paid that cost without filing an invoice. The legal review concluded in 4 months and 19 days. The expulsion was invalidated on 3 procedural grounds, the most significant being the resource denial argument Fouriers had outlined. Humanity had been denied adequate means of defense before a proceeding that stripped them of all standing. The Council's own charter, written before humans had ever reached orbit, contained the mechanism of their reinstatement. This fact became the subject of extensive academic interest among galactic legal scholars, who began publishing papers on what they termed the Osai paradox, the proposition that an institution's rules, applied rigorously enough, contain within them the mechanisms for correcting that institution's own errors, but only if the wronged party possesses the specific capability of Asterisk enduring long enough for the mechanism to activate. Vasamarath's comment, the one about biological volatility, the one that had been in the closed session, the one that had traveled in a human broadcast to reach 37 species who had never been in that room, was read into the official record of the reinstatement proceeding. It was not expunged. Vasamarath requested that it be. The request was denied. The 37 non-council species who had filed on humanity's behalf were, at humanity's formal request, given full council observer status. Not membership observer status, with the pathway to membership clearly defined. This also was not without precedent. It was merely a precedent that had never been activated, because no one had previously had reason to. Humanity had reason. On the day reinstatement took effect, Dr. Osai was back in Lagos, reviewing agricultural yield projections with a team of 12 graduate students who had spent the past 11 months adapting human methodology for use on desert worlds they had never visited, because someone might need it. She received the formal notification on a handheld device. She read it. She set it down. One of the students, the youngest, 22 years old, who had been that 9-year-old's classmate, though Os did not know this, saw her expression and asked quietly, "Good news?" Osai considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "We're back," she said. "Is that good?" She picked up her device and returned to the yield projections. Outside the window, the Lagos sky was the specific shade of orange it achieves in late afternoon, a color that had no name in 37 alien languages and 17 different names in human ones. "Ask me in 50 years," she said. In the council chambers, now empty, the chair where Osai had sat during the hearing remained in position at the floor level, slightly apart from the delegation tiers. No one had moved it. Thesivane noticed this 3 days later, passing through the chamber on an unrelated matter. He stood and looked at it for a moment. The chair was a standard council issue unit. Nothing remarkable about it. No one had intended it to mean anything. It was simply a chair that had been placed for a person who technically had no standing to be in the room, at a table where no one technically had been required to listen, and from which a woman had asked one question that no model and no session transcript and no 43 species deliberation had thought to prepare an answer for. He thought about the 11 pages. He thought about 6 minutes. He thought about 51 days and 41,000 transmissions, and a child in Lagos asking why the stars had banned them. And he thought about the specific kind of courage that is not dramatic and does not look like courage from the outside. That looks instead like a civilization sitting very quietly in a chair it has no right to be in, and simply continuing to work. He did not move the chair. Neither did anyone else. It remained there for 11 years, through 17 sessions, 4 emergency proceedings, and the formal admission of the first 6 former non-member species to full council status, until a new arbiter who did not know its significance finally requested it be cleared for a procedural seating reorganization, at which point every delegate who had been present for the reinstatement proceeding voted, without discussion, without formal motion, without a single word of explanation, to keep it exactly where it was. They did not record the vote. Some things do not need to be in the official record to be permanent. The galaxy would spend decades parsing what had happened, would write the papers and the histories and the legal analyses and the cultural interpretations, would argue about precedent and procedure, and the nature of soft power and the mechanics of institutional reform. But the analysts who got closest to the truth were the ones who stopped looking at the strategy and looked instead at the 51 days. 51 days between expulsion and the first broadcast. The worst 51 days in modern human history by most metrics. No trade, no protection, no legal standing in any jurisdiction beyond their own atmosphere. Every institutional connection they had built for 60 years severed. And somewhere in those 51 days, someone had sat down at an instrument or a keyboard or in a room with others who were equally afraid and had made something new. Not because it would fix anything. Not because they knew what came next. Because it was what humans do when they have run out of everything else. They make something, and they give it away, and they keep going, and they refuse, with a stubbornness that transcends strategy and policy and rational calculation, to become the silence the galaxy had decided they deserved. The chair stayed where it was. The transmissions never stopped. Somewhere in the Orion Arm, a civilization that had been told it was finished was still, quietly, impossibly working.